All right, it is 1:01. We'll go ahead and jump into this. So again, I just want to say thank you all to everyone who is joining us today for our webinar titled Taking Stock of Your Community, Why a Building Inventory Matters. This webinar, like all of our Brownfield webinars, have been brought to you by a partnership between the University of Kentucky's Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky and the Commonwealth of Kentucky's Brownfield office. Through our partnership, we've launched the Brownfield Community Assistance Program that we featured in January's webinar. And as a part of this partnership, we are able to provide additional outreach, educational opportunities, and technical assistance support. And at the end of today's webinar, we will certainly sort of circle back to that technical assistance piece and share some of the ways that you all can lean on us for additional support in your communities as you sort of address brownfields, blight, vacant buildings, downtown revitalization, and so on. But today's topic, like the title slide says, we're going to be taking stock of our communities and really thinking through, why does a building inventory matter? How do we do it? And essentially, what's the value in that? My name is Shane Barton. I'm the Downtown Revitalization and Brownfield Redevelopment Coordinator with CEDIK, the Community and Economic Development Initiative of Kentucky. And today I have Kirsten O'Leary, the Program Coordinator at the Cabinet for Energy and Environment's Kentucky Brownfield Office. Also on the call or on the webinar today, we have my colleague at CEDIK, Tyler McDaniel, and he's joined us in case there are any questions related really to elements that he tends to work with, which is more environmental focused and supporting sort of vulnerable or at-risk communities. So he's joined us, and if there are any questions, we will sort of each divvy those up as they come and respond to them as best as we can today. So let's sort of jump right into this. So really, what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about why building inventories are important. Why should we consider doing one? How do we collect or visualize that data? I'm going to share a couple examples from how other communities have done building inventories, but also how they communicated those results. We'll touch on sort of how to approach the brownfield assessments and redevelopment priorities that are directly related to those inventories. And then, like I mentioned in the introduction, we'll wrap up and discuss some resources available through our Brownfield Community Assistance Program. So typically how this conversation starts is we start to think about vacant buildings. And I will say that almost every community that I work in across the Commonwealth has a vacant building. In most cases, they are vacant buildings that are in some ways problematic, either in their location or in their condition or in the impacts that they are having on adjacent properties. So this is typically the question that initiates a lot of this work, whether it be related to brownfields or downtown revitalization or some of the other topics we'll touch on today. But this is kind of the framing question, right? Do we have a vacant building problem in our community? And most communities will respond with a yes. Now, they may not be highly concentrated, though some are in some communities, in particular communities where we experience disinvestment or depopulation. But this question around vacant properties is really going to be the beginning of our conversation. Now, when we think about vacant properties, often we think about blighted properties. Those buildings that aren't functioning or sort of deteriorating. But I want to make it clear that not all vacant buildings are considered blighted buildings. Just because a building is underutilized doesn't mean that it has fallen into disrepair. It's those buildings that have fallen into disrepair that often get our attention, though. And why is that? Well, blighted buildings, buildings that are falling apart, buildings that are creating safety hazards, buildings that are boarded up, they will demoralize your community. They create a sort of a psychological effect where you begin to become apathetic to them, or begin to believe that nothing can ever be done with them, that they're such a wicked problem that that is how they are going to be forever. But I want to share that's not the case. But here's why blight is sort of so impactful in our communities when those buildings become sort of, or when they fall into disrepair, if you will. Uh, Often, like I just said, they demoralize your community. They create sort of a psychological impact. They are often places for concentrated nefarious activities because no one's living there. There aren't eyes on the properties. We know that these abandoned and blighted properties are also incredibly dangerous for fire hazards. They're often targets of arson. And what we hear often from EMS representatives is that these sites create incredible dangers because firefighters don't know what they are encountering in these sites. They often can pose environmental or other health or safety hazards, especially if they're falling down or falling onto the street or falling onto the sidewalk. They reduce or depress adjacent property values. They often will impact tax revenues as related to those property values. They can slow economic development. And how they do that is we know that when companies who are making substantial investments in communities, they want to make sure that that community is suitable for their investment. And one of the ways that they often determine that is uh, they investigate the quality of life. They may visit your community, and if they drive around your community and see blighted buildings or a lot of vacancies, they're going to have second guesses, second thoughts about making that investment. Because, like this last point, these blighted buildings can often be a detractor for entrepreneurs or developers. But again, just to emphasize here, not all vacant buildings are considered blighted. Okay. But as we redevelop vacant buildings, blighted buildings, or brownfields, there's a couple things that we need to note here. Both the benefits for the community and the benefits for the developer, the person who is working on those sites. We know, just to counterpoint what we just shared, is they can improve the overall economic health and environmental health. They increase local taxes. They can facilitate job growth. Uh, Oftentimes, they'll use existing infrastructure, which is a cost savings measure, and in some cases can support other equity issues. But what we also know in terms of the benefits for the developer is there's often a reduced price. These are sort of cheap properties. They're often in prime locations that have historically been quite active. They're typically you can get favorable zoning or land use provisions because the need is so dramatic to redevelop these. And oftentimes there's public support to move a blighted or vacant building into a productive reuse. Now, many communities, like I said, nearly every community that I've worked with in the Commonwealth has a vacant building or underutilized building. But again, let me make this point. Not every vacant building is a brownfield. And what I mean there, we'll sort of touch on the definition, but I want to emphasize the fact here that every vacant building is an opportunity. Every vacant building provides an opportunity to redevelop that site or space for housing, for retail, for public use. These properties need to be considered as assets rather than liabilities because they each have an inherent opportunity in them. Now, when I said not all vacant buildings are brownfields, this is really what I mean. As we look at the two state laws dictating, or the federal law and the Kentucky law that sort of define brownfields, I've highlighted the piece that is most important in this conversation. And essentially what we're looking at here is these are properties or the expansion or redevelopment or reuse. And this is the part that I want to draw your attention to, which may be complicated to the presence or potential presence of hazardous substances, a pollutant or contaminant. So what we're really talking about is a vacant building, an underutilized site, an abandoned site that is complicated by the presence or potential presence of a contaminant. That is the differentiating characteristic that will make a vacant building a brownfield building or a brownfield site. Kentucky statute, which adds a couple other qualifying things, a little bit longer definition, but also includes this underlined part that I have underlined, that speaks to the complicated redevelopment because of release or perceived release of petroleum, hazardous substance, or pollutant or contaminant. that occurred prior to acquisition. So again, not all vacant buildings are brownfield buildings. And for that vacant building to be considered a brownfield, it needs to meet this definition, which is essentially that the redevelopment of that site is complicated by the real or perceived presence of a contaminant or pollutant. Okay. And so really the key to understand, what makes it a brownfield, we have to conduct a phase 1 or a phase 2 investigation, a site assessment. Phase 1 is like a big book report that describes the history of uses of that site and essentially notes with some probability whether there could be the presence of a potential contaminant that should be further explored. And if that is the case, a phase 2 assessment may be required to actually measure that perceived contamination to determine its impacts or to determine what may be there that may need to be mitigated before redevelopment can occur. Now, examples of brownfields, we've shared this slide often, but these are empty buildings many times with asbestos or lead or other hazardous materials. We have these in our communities, right? These are not foreign buildings. These are not buildings that we're not used to seeing. So old factories or industrial sites, gas stations, dry cleaners, rail yards or shipping yards, sometimes even vacant lots or open fields that once contained some of these uses, and old schools, hospitals, or other institutional spaces. Now, all of those sites provide an opportunity. Really, that's one point I want to kind of hammer today is that vacant buildings, blighted buildings, and brownfield buildings and sites all provide an opportunity. And the opportunities for those sites include new retail or commercial properties, new entertainment or restaurants, parks, community recreation facilities, gardens, community gardens, obviously housing, community centers. We've seen all of these things play out. So again, these are the opportunities that are latent in these buildings and sites in our communities. Now, as we think about what this process looks like, back to the building inventory conversation here today. I've noted in this where the building inventory, the identify and assess is located. It's pretty soon. It's pretty early in the process. It's one of the first steps that help us start to plan and really start to move forward in finding appropriate reuse strategies, thinking about what it takes to get there, thinking about what those reuse visions are, engaging the community around those topics, and then lastly, thinking about what the resources that need to be aggregated to accomplish that process. So it often includes, as one of the first steps, a building inventory. And why does a building inventory matter, right? Like why do we do this? Well, it's the starting point. It's where we start to collect data. It's where we start to kind of conceptualize and tell our story. We start to see where these sites may be. We determine the concentration. We start to think about where they're located, what they're adjacent to, what impacts they may have. And all of those sorts of tangential conversations really provide us engagement opportunities to get citizens involved in those conversations, because every one of the answers to the questions I just shared impact the residents in that community. So beginning with a building inventory often provides us an opportunity to get citizens or other stakeholders involved. Having a comprehensive list of problematic properties or vacant buildings really helps us begin to prioritize our redevelopment projects or redevelopment plans. Whether we're thinking about the financial feasibility or which ones may be catalytic in terms of spurring additional growth or investment, to the ones that are creating the largest sort of environmental or human health safety impacts. This is the beginning of how we get to the answers of those questions. We have to have a list. We have to have the information, right? But also having a list of available properties can help us attract private sector interest or in outside investors, because being able to show available properties. For example, the state has a list of available sites for industrial investors, industrial park users. So just having kind of the real estate aggregated to show what's available, what inventory or excuse me, what infrastructure it may have access to, where it's located, which communities, those sorts of things are elements that an outside investor will certainly be interested in knowing. And having all of that in one place can certainly help transfer or sell those properties, or really facilitate productive reuse of those properties. But lastly, it really can aid you in securing grants and funding. In particular, EPA brownfield grants, whether it be assessment or cleanup grants. Having that building inventory is kind of critical. It is a specific question that you're asked about. You have to be able to note specific buildings. Now, those buildings can change, or you can grow that list, but you have to have at least a preliminary idea of which sites are of interest to you and your community as the applicant. The other piece here is that when we think about grants in general, we know that all grants are going to require you to describe your need, to tell your story, and to have sort of viable data that you can reference and note the numbers or concentrations of vacant or blighted or brownfield buildings can be a critical element in your ability to be a competitive grant applicant, because you're able to articulate a community need with great detail. Okay. But what is a building inventory, right? What are we actually talking about here? In general, what we're really talking about is some systematic process or record of vacant or underutilized properties that typically documents a couple broad categories, right? Where's it at? Who owns it? What condition is it in? What's the current zoning? What that impacts what could be developed there later. Are there any environmental concerns, and so forth? But these are some other elements. Sometimes you may name the parcel. It may have a code or identifier, especially if you're using PVA data. You're going to want to know ownership, because if you're going through the brownfield process to get that property assessed, you have to have the permission of that property owner to access the property. Typically, it'll include a site description, some general characteristics around the condition, a description of the building itself, the site history, if you have that. What's it been used for? What's its history? Are there any tax implications? Are the taxes up to date? Are the taxes not being paid? Are there liens being put on the building? Especially if there's any known or suspected releases, thinking about what those prior uses were, the site history, what's the propensity of some sort of an environmental contaminant condition. Was there any assessment or cleanup of that property in the past? Are there any redevelopment plans that include that site or property or adjacent properties or properties within its vicinity? Is it targeted for redevelopment already in your community? And any other sort of risk reduction activities, whether it be related to crime or fire or other infrastructure improvements. Now, I want to make this point here that the inventory obviously serves many purposes, but probably and perhaps the most important to me as I think about the brownfield redevelopment or downtown revitalization process is that it is an excellent opportunity to engage the community in collecting data, discussing the impacts, and coming up with solutions. Again, a great opportunity for engaged assessments to get those residents, business owners, and building owners involved. So, how do you get started? Where's the starting point? Well, often it starts with that question, right? Or do we have vacant buildings? A concerned citizen or an elected official or someone who works within an agency or department that supports that municipality may be concerned about vacancy or underutilized spaces. So we tend to define the purpose first. Why are we doing this? Are we interested in sort of spurring economic development? Are we interested in dealing with vacant properties? Are we interested in dealing with environmental hazards or risk? Are we interested in economic development, or are we interested in new housing, redevelopment of old housing into new sites? What is our purpose? And frankly, it can be a little bit of all of that. It doesn't have to be so specific, but you certainly need to know why you are engaging in a building inventory, what you're hoping to accomplish with it, but so you can communicate it to your community and those residents. Again, next step, you're going to engage those stakeholders, invite them to participate, invite them to share their concerns, invite them to get involved in the assessment itself, in the inventory. So we're talking residents, planners, realtors, business and building owners, your codes enforcement, your emergency management. Really, everyone in your community has a stake in this conversation. Now, oftentimes folks start with kind of going to public records or PVA to get those records, in particular to identify ownership. Uh, Sometimes these 2 points are switched in terms of the site visits and maybe doing a driving tour, a walking tour, sort of preliminarily identifying buildings of concern, taking that list and then going to the PVA to collect information on it so you can then start to build that inventory a little bit more robustly. So I'm not going to prescribe which one needs to come first, but they often fall around the same time. Now, the next big component here is to incorporate those findings into sort of a broader conversation, to collecting community input, reviewing public policies, figuring out what opportunities they are currently to deal with it, maybe thinking about why those policies or opportunities aren't being effective in dealing with the vacant problem, so that then you can get to kind of some underlying issues or conditions that you may want to focus on. Now, lastly, the other piece that varies widely is the use of digital tools to help both visualize your information or tell your story with data, right? So some folks may use GIS or Esri products, which does take a particular high level of skill to be able to sort of navigate and utilize effectively. But I'm going to also share some stories about how Google Maps, just simply using a Google Map or other technology mapping tools, can be effective technology as well. You're obviously going to use some spreadsheets. You want to digitize this information, whether it's in a spreadsheet or a database that you can dig into. But you are going to want to track this digitally. And you're going to want to do that so that you can, one, visualize your information. You can do sort of quick assessments. You don't want this to live in a Word document, though it may start there, and you certainly don't want it to live in a notebook with handwritten notes, because you can't assess that. You can't review it. Make sure you're digitizing these records after you've collected them by hand or by other methods. And I'll share some examples there as well. So, you may ask yourself, right? We have a vacant building problem, but how do we start addressing it? Again, it starts with that inventory. It starts with acknowledging that we've got some vacancies. Let's find out where else we may have vacant properties. Let's start to create a list so that then we can visualize that information and have these conversations. So I want to tell you a little story about the city of Harlan, Kentucky, in Harlan County. In 2019, a small team of engaged citizens and organizational representatives there with tourism, with the city, with local economic development, kept hearing from constituents that the majority of downtown Harlan was vacant, and that was often a public concern. Well, what they did is they said that was their question. That was their purpose. Let's determine how much vacancy or occupancy we're dealing with here so we can come up with a plan to address it. So this is just a simple Google map of their downtown area. They created a target area, which you can essentially see in the green and red shaded areas. And they did a walking tour. So on foot, they walked around downtown, they assessed, they wrote notes, and then they went back to this digital tool and basically screenshotted the map and then put polygons on top, sort of symbolizing whether it was occupied or whether it was vacant. Now, anecdotally, if you ask anyone in town, they would tell you that 80% of downtown was vacant. But what they actually found was that it was kind of the opposite. That frankly, just over 20% of the buildings were vacant, which is still 1 in 5. That's still a fairly high number, right? But what what the visualization showed was that the concentration on one particular block, as you come into downtown, as you're headed to the courthouse where many people travel, nearly that entire block was abandoned, creating the perception for those visitors and residents that the entire town was vacant. Now, they informed themselves, they did the inventory, they visualized the data, they were able to tell the story, right? Then came the action. How do we address it? Their process was to reach out and engage those building owners first, with an opportunity to help that building owner either lease, sell, or transfer the property so that it could then go in the hands or be utilized by someone who had an idea or what we would call a productive reuse, right? So they created this great event. They celebrated each of these buildings' histories. They made it a thing, a conversation. They brought a crowd out. They invited realtors. They invited residents. They invited investors, and they did a tour of all of these buildings, at least the ones where the building owners were interested in receiving some support in that building having a productive reuse, right? And what they have been able to do since then, and now we're about 6 years past this. Nearly every building, almost 100% of all these buildings in Harlan are occupied now. You cannot buy a building that is available right now. It's a pretty stark difference. There's been lots of investment, local businesses that have grown and expanded, and really this is a wonderful success story around collecting the information, visualizing the information, engaging building owners with really with a carrot. There was nothing enforcement, there was nothing regulatory, there were no gotcha moments here. This was essentially a community reaching out to these building owners and asking, how can we help you? How can we help you sort of transfer or bring a better use to this site to improve the community we care about? And they had a great response. So again, nothing too incredibly technical here, a very pragmatic approach to dealing with vacant buildings in a way that engage those building owners with solutions. Okay. The next sort of example here is a building inventory conducted in Manchester, Kentucky. This was completed, I believe, in 2018, 2019, as a part of a power-funded Appalachian Regional Commission grant that we worked on to support 8 counties doing downtown revitalization. And Manchester, Kentucky, and Clay County just happened to be one of those. So you can see there are 3 different maps of that community. These are pretty technical maps. They were created by design students, by interns. So I say that to suggest this type of visualization did take a little bit more technical expertise to make. But in terms of being able to visualize it, I'm not sure I would say that it is any more impactful than the map I just showed you with the Google and polygons, right? It just so happened that we had the capacity and the support of students to be able to engage in this work. Now, what we have here, like I said, are 3 different building inventories. And this was a part of their downtown revitalization planning, where they really wanted to investigate their downtown. They wanted to sort of see, are there pockets of buildings that are vacant? Are there sort of concentrated areas where we should focus redevelopment priorities? What are the current uses in terms of land use or property use? So the top right shows all of the buildings, and they're color coded in terms of civic spaces, residential or commercial. And you can see a pretty high concentration of commercial in that downtown district, with residential and civic sort of interspersed or on the fringe of the downtown. Now, if you look to the bottom right, this is really just a map that shows, is this being actively used? Is it passively used? And what we mean there, or is it generating traffic? Not people gridlock stuck in cars, but do these sites generate foot traffic? Do people get on the sidewalk? If you've been on our webinars before, you've probably heard me say that I believe humans are the indicator species of a healthy environment, and that the more humans we see on the sidewalk, the more opportunities those humans have to go into stores or support other businesses as they pass by. So this is really kind of an indication of, are these traffic generating sites? Do they attract people? Are they actively being used? And again, you can see that concentration in that downtown core where those commercial spaces are, where people are going to shop or conduct business. And as we move out to the residential, those are considered more passive uses, right? But then the one on the left really is more of an investigation. They were concerned that they were losing the historic character of their community. They acknowledged that they had lost a number of historic buildings that had been vacant or burned down. And they were afraid that if they lost all of these buildings, that they would begin to lose that historical character that so many residents sort of lean into as a defining characteristic of this community. And you can see that the orange buildings highlighted here do show a number of historic or older buildings that have been lost since 1980. So again, this was a little bit more of a technical mapping exercise in terms of the building inventory. It was used in multiple ways to help prioritize redevelopment, to help focus downtown revitalization planning, to really focus on public policy around the community's desire to maintain the building inventory or building stock in that historical character. So it's serving a number of purposes, but this data visualization tells us a big, these three simple or relatively simple images tell a big story. But I certainly don't want to suggest that this was simple or easy. That this level of visualization and graphic does take a little bit of skill to be able to sort of create. But I don't want to suggest that this is the only way to visualize your data, especially when we think about the previous example I shared in Harlan County. Now, lastly, I want to share a report. This is a bad buildings report. So some of our colleagues who focus on brownfield redevelopment in the state of West Virginia have an amazing program called the Bad Buildings Program, where they work with communities really to think and analyze. They have an amazing process, and I would invite you to check them out. They have a great website with a number of resources. But in 2022, they conducted, in partnership with the Cumberland County, Kentucky, they conducted a bad buildings inventory and released this report for Cumberland County. And again, it's another example of how to sort of visualize and communicate your building inventory. So this process really sort of surveys properties under three major categories. They look at the physical property characteristic. They have a sheet that helps you sort of quantify the indicators of vacancy so that you can put a metric on each or put a number on each building. And they also have a property condition checklist as a part of their process. Again, a great methodology. Their property characteristics, we're often talking about some of the same information we shared a couple slides before: the address, property type, any construction permits, latitude, longitude, the date it was built, how old it was, the lot size, or whether or not it appears to be occupied or vacant, right? Then the indicators of vacancy really are 9 questions that really help you discern visible signs of vacancy, such as a neglected yard, abandoned mail, boarded up windows or doors, or existing fire damage that would make that house uninhabitable. So the checklists are really designed to give kind of a general description of the structure, but each of these are essentially scored, like I said, to provide a metric, an impact, that a metric that is relative to the impact created by this vacant property. And in their report, They often list those properties. They provide a great summary of existing public policy, both at the state and local level that could be used to address it, and provide a series of recommendations on how that community could begin to addressing their issue. But I share this simply to share another example of how building inventories are approached. And again, I would invite you to check out their website for additional resources. It's a great example to explore. One last sort of example that I want to share is one sort of dictated or articulated in the EPA Revitalization Ready Guide. I know this is a long website. I will certainly send this out to registered attendees, and I will also send a copy of the workbook. This is a great document. As I fumble over here beside me, I actually have the physical version of this document here in my office that I refer to quite often. It's a great guide. It's very comprehensive, but it really provides a pretty great process for evaluating properties and how to move that inventory into action. They have an adjoining workbook that is essentially an Excel spreadsheet with a bunch of workbook pages in it that help you track what you've done and each kind of build on the next. And I'll show examples of that in just a moment. But again, a great methodology. It's sort of a how-to step-by-step guide. It's available on the EPA website. But if you have any issues, let me know and I can email you a copy. Again, the workbook that accompanies this document is an incredibly valuable tool. Even if you don't use it completely, I would certainly recommend that you take a look at it to see if it inspires how you may sort of conceptualize your own building inventory. So the workbook, like I said, is a series of each of these bullet points is a spreadsheet within that document. It allows you to capture who your stakeholders are, what your goals are, property inventory, property characteristics, land use characteristics, environmental conditions, community sort of elements or assets, community data, if you will. Then it really gets into some market-driven things like your market assessment, your revitalization priorities, any existing constraints on that property. And it also provides a great worksheet to start to do some preliminary pro forma or financial feasibility. Again, a great tool that I would recommend you at least explore and certainly explore that worksheet. And these are just some screenshots of what you'll see. This is an example of the stakeholder sheet where you can start to include or start to identify and document those stakeholders. The one on the left is an example of sort of the property details, property condition. And then the one on the right are some of the characteristics. So again, you can see that it's all created for you. It's plug and play. Basically, you're filling in the blank. And those answers sort of carry on. They're all sort of linked and connected through that spreadsheet. Again, a great effective digital tool for you to think about utilizing as a part of a building inventory process. But I think as we get into this, we need to have some realistic expectations about what we're doing and why. It's important to consider your constraints because those might shape your overall goals. And your building inventory, just because you have a reuse vision, there are other elements that you have to sort of consider. The financial side, the market study or pro forma. Does the math? Can you pay for this? What's it going to cost? What's the outcome of that investment? What sort of resources do we have? Kind of what's the nature or timing of the property transfer that we're talking about here? But after we conduct the inventory, really some of these next big questions are any of these buildings revitalization ready? Are they any that we need to consider for environmental assessments to determine if they're brownfields, and what funding may we want to investigate to support those brownfields or other redevelopment options? And then lastly, what partners can we create? What other state or federal partners can we engage to have these conversations? Now, excuse me, as we think about these sites and the feasibility, I often encourage folks to think about catalytic sites. Think about where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. Prioritize those. And the questions you should be asking yourself are they in the area of concern? Is there any plan alignment? Do they align with redevelopment plans or capital improvement plans that our community may have? Are they going to spur future development? How likely are they to sort of attract other adjacent investments? And are they going to is redevelopment actually going to eliminate or address conditions of blight? Right. So again, really think about those catalytic sites as you start to investigate redevelopment priorities, in particular as you're discerning whether or not they are brownfields via an assessment, a phase one or a phase two, or vacant or blighted buildings that may need some other type of resource or investigation. Okay. Now, as we sort of wrap up here today, I do want to share some available resources to you all that myself and Kirsten and Tyler can help provide. So again, we've mentioned phase one and phase twos. Also, the ABCA, which I have not mentioned, but that is an analysis of cleanup alternatives that help you think about what would I need to do with this contaminated site to make it safe for my prioritized reuse. So the State Brownfield Office has available resources to help you conduct those phase ones or phase twos. As it comes to grant writing or seeking funding, we can often write letters of review. We can help you sort of review your draft proposals, but we also offer a number of grant writing workshops. Now, in terms of the specific technical assistance around the Brownfield program, a big portion of the Brownfield program is about liability protection, right? Protecting the new owner of this building from the existing contamination. So if liability protection is a concern, I would certainly suggest reaching out to Kirsten to learn more about that. But in terms of sort of the broader education and outreach, events that we hold. Obviously, you're familiar with our webinars because you're on one or watching this one today. We develop resource materials that we share or sort of aggregate other people's resource materials to make or provide access to. We conduct site visits and do tours and walking tours to sort of have those preliminary conversations. We can certainly help you with some planning. Think about visioning or reuse strategies. We can help think about the process for building inventory or how you would engage your community around that, thinking about those catalyst sites or community needs. And then largely all of this is sort of under this broader umbrella of providing grant application support because all of these elements help you be a competitive applicant. Now, a couple upcoming opportunities. I want to make sure you all know about our upcoming Brownfield Boot Camp. This is scheduled later this month, Thursday and Friday, March 20th and 21st. It is free of charge. You do not have to pay anything to attend. We're holding this in Frankfurt. It's a 2-day intensive training where we will be covering everything Brownfield related. You'll go through sort of a series of trainings the first day, including a grant writing training. And on the second day, we really hone in and focus on the grant application and think about all of the elements of the grant, whether it be an assessment or cleanup grant, and how to be as most competitive as possible so that you can direct those federal dollars to your community to address these lingering issues. Okay. Now, again, sort of as we think about sort of community support and technical assistance, I just want to come back to this one last time. Please, if you're not receiving our monthly letter, let me know. I'd love to get you signed up. Attend our events, join our webinars. If you'd like for us to come visit, let us know. We'd love to come to your community, conduct a site visit, talk to you about the issues you're facing with vacancy or brownfield, so that we could then sort of work through some of these other questions and think about the best ways we could support you, not just now, but in the future. So without sort of saying too much more or rambling more about the importance or process around building inventories, I do want to open it up here briefly for any questions, Q&A. You should see a Q&A function on your Zoom interface. And I just want to provide a few minutes here as we wrap up to address any questions or comments that you all may have as your as we're sort of wrapping up here. I believe you should have the Q&A function. I'm going to open up here. I'm not seeing any coming in, but I'll give it just another minute or two. Kirsten or Tyler, if you all have anything that you'd like to add, I'd love to welcome you to the conversation. Like I said, we'll give folks just another moment or two to add any questions or comments if they have them.
The only thing that I thought of just as a quick little thing before we end is just having a set of fresh eyes on your community. CEDIK does a lot of cool things like what's the program called, Shane?
The First Impressions program.
First Impressions program. And also kind of when we come and do a site visit for your community, it's like our own little mini version of First Impressions. Just like taking notes and figuring out even people that are familiar with brownfields and the brownfield program and all of the opportunities that are within that. It's kind of like, oh, I'd never thought about that building possibly being a brownfield or that kind of thing. So it is beneficial just to have a set of fresh eyes, especially, maybe one of us that's familiar with the program, to come and, walk your community, drive around, and just kind of point out some possible opportunities. And Shane frames it really well as all of these potential brownfield sites are opportunities. So.
And in fact, we saw that kind of play out last week. We were on a number of site visits in Western Kentucky, looking at buildings, and in every location we went to, our team, who was putting fresh eyes on different buildings and sites, identified places that I would just say kind of fell in love. I think our team that visits does have a penchant for architecture and kind of community history and those nostalgic buildings. And in each of those communities, we were able to identify sites that we resonated with as opportunities. And in some cases, community representatives agreed. In other cases, they agreed, but maybe those buildings weren't priorities. They may not have seen the inherent value that we may have been able to witness or articulate. And I think it just leads to a more in-depth conversation, frankly, around the pool of buildings and sites that should be considered opportunities. Because that's really what this is all about. It's about moving essentially what is kind of a negative in our community or a deterrent to investment into an opportunity to improve both the quality of life and local economics of those communities. So with that being said, I'm not seeing any Q&A, not seeing any questions. I want to thank you all so much for your attendance and joining us today. Our next webinar is scheduled for later this month. We're going to be really focusing on demystifying the EPA Brownfield grant. We've been including those notes, those registration links in our newsletters, but I will certainly include that as a part of this recording once it is available to share. Again, thank you all for joining us today. If you're watching after the fact, thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to either of us. And we look forward to meeting with you. And in particular, if you're interested in having those fresh eyes in your communities, reach out to us and let's schedule a site visit to come and start the conversation. With that said, have a great day, and we'll see you all soon.